Hey folks, welcome back for another episode of Code Club. In this episode, I am going to be doing a constructive critique of this figure that was published in a paper from the journal Nature. What is a constructive critique? I'm glad you asked. Well, there are 4 components as I do it. The first is a description. What is the context? What is the paper? What is the audience of the figure? Then the next is analysis. What types of figures, what types of plots are used across the paper in the different figures? What are the different elements within these particular figures that we want to think about more from a technical level? Third is interpretation. Does the interpretation that the authors discussed within the paper or in the title of the figure match what we actually see in the data? When we look at the data in the panel, what is our takeaway? What does that cause us to think about? Finally is judgment. How effective were the authors in creating this figure to convey the story that they wanted to tell? Is there room for improvement? Are there things that are really cool that we would like to incorporate in our own work? Well, that is a constructive critique. DAIJ is the acronym that I run with. As I mentioned, this figure comes to us from a paper published in the journal Nature. The title was Lymph Node Environment Drives MSP1 Targetability in Metastasizing Melanoma. It has a set of 30 authors, primarily from the Harvard School of Public Health. The first author is Mario Palma, and the last is Jesselyn Ubelacher. I apologize for mispronunciation. As you would expect from papers published in the Journal of Nature, this represents a tremendous body of work, and you can understand perhaps why there are 30 authors. So for those of you who are uninitiated into the world of science, Nature is one of the top journals. We might think of Nature and Science at the top. Perhaps you'd throw Cell in there as well. Nature is a broad scope science journal. You'll see everything in there, including physics, math, earth science, biology, biomedical stuff. If it's science, it's in Nature. It is published in the UK, and it is a commercial publisher. And so they are not associated with a professional society. They are not associated with a nonprofit. They are very much for profit. So as flawed a metric as the journal impact factor is, the impact factor for Nature is 50. That is huge. We talked last week about a paper that was in the journal Nature Microbiology, which you might consider to be one rung below this. That journal had an impact factor of 20. So these papers in the journal Nature tend to get cited a lot in the first couple of years after being published. And of course, we'd expect them to get published a lot going out from there. So if your paper is accepted at the journal Nature, I think they have about an 80% rejection rate. If it gets accepted though, it will cost you about 12 grand US dollars to get it published as an open access, which this article, as you can see in the upper left here, is an open access article, which means that anybody can get this article for free. If you want to get this article and read it and check out the figures along with me, by all means do go down below in the description for this episode, and you will see a link to this article there. So the venue for the figure that I'm critiquing today, of course, comes from a scientific paper. You can read that paper on a website. You can download the PDF and read it as a PDF, and you can actually get a physical copy of the paper, right? And so it is in a bit of a different format depending on how you read it, right? And so let's think about figure 1. As we read through this article, well, here is figure 1. If you want to see a full-size image, you can click on that link, and then you see a full-size image. And it is quite large at this scale, right? Alternatively, if we looked at a PDF, it would look a lot like this. And in fact, my printed version is a printed version of the PDF. Most people these days still read things in PDFs. I don't know how many people print things out like I do, but I think realizing that people view things as PDFs is also informative because you can look at the text here and see if it is a large enough scale to read. Again, the benefit of a PDF is you can zoom in. Alternatively, as I showed in the last episode, if I look at the full-size version of this image, and if I want to zoom in, the text gets bigger, but the figure does not get bigger, right? And so I think, at least at this resolution, the superscripts in some of these p-values are a bit hard to read, but I think these are all important things to consider when you're thinking about how the figure is going to be consumed by the audience. And when I look at the printed version of the figure, as you can see here on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, I can kind of read those p-values. So again, it's important to consider the venue where you are presenting your figure to think about how that figure is going to be consumed. I always encourage people to print off their figures at the size that it will be in a printed paper, and to also generate the figure within those dimensions. So as we think more about the context of this article and this figure, Nature has a section at the bottom of every article saying about this article. In fact, most journals will tell you this information of when it was received and when it was accepted. And so we see that it was received August 21st of 2024, and it was accepted October 6th of 2025. So this took about 14 months from initial submission to being accepted. Now, of course, there were multiple rounds of peer review, which means that a reviewer or set of reviewers reviewed the research, sent it back to the authors. The authors perhaps had to do more experiments. They then revised the manuscript and then resubmitted, and that can happen a couple times. One other thing that Nature provides is the peer review file. And so you can look through this peer review file, which comes in at 37 pages, and it includes all the reviewer information. And further down in here, you'll see the authors here put their responses in blue along with the comments from the reviewers, along with any other things that they included. When I looked through this peer review history, I didn't notice any obvious signs that the reviewers were critiquing the composition of the figures. If they talked about the figures, it was more in the context of interpreting the figure. So as I mentioned, the audience of the journal Nature is very broad, everything perhaps from math to social science to biomedical and everything in between. What would be the audience for this article? Well, you would think that it's not just going to be cell biologists or not just oncologists, right? It's going to have data that integrates across those different disciplines. And so I would think that the audience for this would be cell biologists, oncologists, people who study cancer, and perhaps drug developer scientists, chemists, and natural product discovery and synthesis types of folks. Because as you read through this, you see like in the first sentence of the abstract that ferroptosis has emerged as an actionable target to eliminate therapy-resistant and metastatic cancers, right? Their goal here is to develop science that can be actionable for designing drugs to treat therapy-resistant and metastatic cancers. And so this leads us into thinking more about the background of the article itself, right? So clearly, cancers that are developing resistance to the drugs that are available is a bad thing, because then that's going to increase the propensity of recurrence and further progression of the disease. Cancer is obviously a huge problem. Melanoma, being skin cancer, is also a huge problem. Cancer is clearly bad. They talk about ferroptosis in the opening sentence of the abstract, as I mentioned, and down here, they talk about what is ferroptosis, right? And so ferroptosis is a non-apoptotic cell death modality, right? And so apoptosis is a programmed cell death, and ferroptosis is a non-apoptotic form of cell death. And so we can tell by the name that ferroptosis is triggered by iron in some form, right? Because ferro, like ferrous, is iron, right? So it's going to be an iron-dependent lipid oxidation that then triggers this form of cell death. This is well outside of my area of research. And so again, when I do these videos, I'm not trying to critique the science, I'm trying to critique the visualization. And so I make no claims that this is good or bad science. It was peer-reviewed, it was published, that's good enough for me. Other people can quibble about the details of the science. So as we can see over in the right side, this paper has 5 figures, and then it has, I think it has another 10 or so extended data figures. So if we look at the different figures that show up in the main body of the article, those figures that would appear in the PDF, as I said, there are 5 of those. And so this is the one that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. But we see a description of the mouse model. We see a scatter plot looking at correlations. We see an immunoblot. And then we see data quantifying that immunoblot. If we kind of keep going through, We see similar types of presentations of data, right? We see these bar plots with points over top of them with error bars in figure 2, much like we have in the lower right corner of figure 1. They, of course, have other scatter plots showing an ordination, a model, a heat map. Figure 3 then has more of those bar plots, some heat maps, some microscopy, some more immunoblots. Figure 4 has more microscopy, more of those bar plots with points on them, and we see some violin plots, which is interesting, and we see some line plots from, I think, analysis of these microscopy images, and again, some more immunoplots. And then in figure 5, more heat maps, more scatter plots, but this time with box and whisker plots behind them. And then we see a model and more of those bar plots with jittered points over top of them. And then some, I don't know what these are. I guess these are a relative viability. This is perhaps kind of like survivor curves over increasing concentrations of some compound. So we see a variety of figure types. And I think the types of figures are fairly well represented here. That this type of bar plot overlaid with points, overlaid with error bars, is fairly commonly seen across this figure. B and C here are another form of scatter plot that appear in this figure, right? I'm not going to talk about the immunoplots or the model, but I think this is all interesting. Again, one thing I do find interesting is that I think we saw that in figure 5. So they do have this type of panel that we saw back in figure 1, but they're also showing similar types of data as a box and whisker plot. Also, back here, they had violin plots, which would be another way to represent the same data, and that they show violin plots right next to these other bar plots like we saw in figure 1 is interesting. I am curious about what would cause authors to pick one representation of the data over another. Do they just want to have variation? Or is there something that they're trying to describe here by picking different types of plots that are associated with the different types of data? So let's turn our attention to figure 1, which is the figure I want to critique specifically in this video. We start with the figure caption. The title of the figure is LN, or lymph node metastatic lines, exhibit elevated FSP1 and reduced GCLC, GPX4, and ACSL4 expression. That is a declarative title. You know it's declarative because it has a verb in it, right? So exhibit, right? And so this is the authors telling us what they want to take away from this figure, okay? And then we have below that a rather, well, for nature, I think actually a short caption. This is a lot of kind of brief description of what is in each of the panels. And as you can see from how they've grouped some of the captions down here in the text, that they are acknowledging that many of these panels are similar to each other, that they go together, right? And so if they say like individual is E, G, I, and K, and then grouped F, H, J, L, so F, H, J, L are the grouped, and then that they talk about the 4 different genes being E and F, G and H, I and L, K and L. As I mentioned earlier, they have an immunoblot over on the left, and so the data over on the right here for panels E through L is quantifying the density of these bands. So let's focus again on panels B and C. They're very similar to each other, so I think we can talk about one without worrying too much about shorting the other. Let's think about the various aesthetics that are being used in these panels. So first of all, on the x-axis aesthetic, we have the generation, and on the y-axis, we have the GCLC or the FSP1 TPM. TPM is short for transcripts per million, and so out of 1 million transcripts, this is how many transcripts aligned with either GCLC or FSP1. In terms of the generation on the x-axis, I suppose we do need to know a little bit about the experiment. So the way I understand the model worked is that they had a parental cell line B16F0, which they implanted into a mouse. They then let that tumor develop and grow. They then isolated it, made a cell line from that, used that to implant another mouse, and then they repeated this isolation and re-implantation into successive mice until they had 9 different cell lines. And so that then gave them these LN metastatic lines. So what we see on the x-axis then is those different generations. So F0 being the parental, and then 1 through 9 being the successive cell lines. And as I already mentioned, a measure of the gene expression on the y-axis. They also used color as an aesthetic here. And so we can see those colors detailed in the legend in the upper right of B and in the upper left of C, where they are coloring the points or the generations according to what stage they believe that they belong to, right? So these purple are early, this orange is mid, the brown is mid-late, and the green is late. The black over here are the parental. They've also added a statistical layer, which is a smoothing or a curve fitting of the data. And so we can see this line kind of going down through or up through on the right side panel. And this is a fit of the data, a linear fit. It's not a spline or a curve or some type of polynomial. It is a linear fit that also then has confidence bands around it showing the standard error. I noticed that the standard error bands are not solid lines. They have a little bit of dashing to them, whereas the fit itself is a solid line. They've then added an annotation to the bottom left corner of these plots, the R squared, which is the Pearson R correlation coefficient squared, right? And so they're saying basically 0.6 and 0.3, describing the amount of variation that is described by the linear fit, right? That's basically how good of a fit is aligned through these data. And so it's basically saying 0.6 is that it describes 60% of the variation of the data. 0.3 is about 30% of the variation in the data. I don't know off the top of my head what the raw R was. That would give you a sign that would be negative in panel B because it's going down, and positive for C because it's going up. Let's do a similar type of analysis then for panels E through L. Let's focus on E because it's going to be representative of G, I, and K. And that on the x-axis, we have the different cell lines. So we have the parental, and then we have the very first mouse that was implanted into. And then we have these late stage from days 7, 8, and 9. So we can see the first three letters, LN1, LN7, corresponds to the generation number that we saw on the x-axis of panels B and C. On the y-axis then, we have the relative GCLC levels. And so this is a quantification of the amount of protein in those cells. It's not expression, whereas B and C was expression, E through L is amount of protein. And so on the y-axis, as I mentioned, we have the relative GCLC levels. These appear to be relative to the parental strain. So how much GCLC was in L9 relative to what we saw back in the parental line. The color of the points and the bar corresponds back to the stages that we saw in panels B and C, where black was used for the parental, this purplish was used for the day 1 or generation 1, and then the green was for the late stages. I would say they've used 1 geome and 2 statistical layers here. So again, thinking in terms of R and how I would do this in R, they've used a jittered point where they've added variation in the x-axis to prevent overplotting in the points. So if we have like B16F0, there's a number of points here, right? And they're jittered left to right within that column. And again, that helps us to see how many points there are, right? So like over here in this L9 1358IR, horrible names, there appear to be 6 points, right? And so you can see those points. And so the plotting of the points would be done with a geome that has some jittering across the x-axis. Then the 2 statistical layers that they perhaps would have used if they'd made these in R would be to plot the mean of those points using a bar, that the bar goes up to the mean of those points. And then they've also added confidence intervals indicating plus or minus the standard deviation. And so in the caption and in their methods, they talk about basically anywhere you see an error bar here, it's the mean plus or minus a standard deviation. I should also go back and say these were not made in R. They tell us that they made all of the figures using GraphPad Prism. Now, for the annotation, they have added p-values of a couple of different varieties to panel E, G, I, and K. So there's a p-value across the top, and this is from an analysis of variance, basically asking the question of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 categories across the x-axis, are any of these significantly different from the others, right? It's not saying which, but are any significantly different from the others? And so as you can see, really from all of these panels, the p-values for that kind of experiment-wide analysis are quite small, right? I think the largest, at least for E, G, I, and K, was 2 times 10 to the minus 7, right? That is a very small number, right? So we have confidence that at least one of the different cell lines was significantly different from all the other conditions being considered. That is the p-value at the top. They tell us that that was done by ANOVA. We then have individual p-values above each of the bars in these 4 panels. And these p-values are calculated using a Dunnett's test, a post hoc comparison, where they compare each of these cell lines back to B16F0, back to the parental strain. And so this is saying, now that we know that there's something different among all these conditions, which is significantly different through the parental strain. And so that Dunnett's test will then generate a p-value telling you which of these is significantly different from the others. And it then also applies a correction for multiple comparisons that's baked into how the test is performed. What we see in E is that all of these p-values are quite small. Again, I think the largest p-value is 1.8 times 10 to the minus 12. If we then look at panels F, H, J, and L, the main difference between these panels and what we saw like in E, G, I, and K is that the test that was performed was a two-tailed t-test with a correction applied. And basically what they're doing is they're taking the data from B16F0, that's these points here above the parental bar, and then all of the green points they're pooling together for the LN bar, right? And then they're making a statistical comparison. Otherwise, they're all the same. So in the text associated with figure 1, they give more of a fleshing out of what each of these different panels indicates. And so what they say that's relevant to the panels I'm interested in, B and C, is that gene expression analysis showed progressive decrease in GCLC, an increase in FSP1 across the LN line generations. And so they corroborated this using qPCR. But there was no significant difference in the mRNA levels of GXP, ACSL4, ACSL3, or SLC7A11, right? There they point to the extended data figure 1D through H, which is this figure. And so what we find then are 2 of those genes, so GX4 and ACSL4, correspond to the bottom row of panels back in our figure 1. And we can see fairly similar plots. We can see there that the R-squared values are quite small, indicating the line doesn't do a very good job of fitting through the data. Again, that is not a measure of the slope. It's a measure of the amount of variation explained by the line going through the data. So if you were wondering where are the scatter plots for basically this bottom row, they're over in the extended data figure. Again, what we have on top is the gene expression, and the bottom then are the protein levels. And so at least my way of using expression, like they have here in the title, is that this is actually not true, right? That FSP1 is elevated, that's here on the right. GCLC, here on the left, is reduced. But in terms of expression, as we saw from this, they aren't changed, right? But in terms of protein being created, they are correct, right? So FSP1, is that being elevated? Yes, these green bars are all higher than the F0, and we also see that in the pooled analysis. Whereas GCLC here, the GPX4 here, and then the ACSL4 here are lower than what we saw for the parental strain. And again, that's in the individual analysis, as well as in the pooled analysis that we saw like in F, H, J, and L. So as I always say, a good figure will prompt me to ask more questions. And I don't know this field very well, so it's a little bit harder for me to ask these types of questions. But something that, I look at this data and I kind of feel like the late are not that different than the mid-late, right? And so I wonder if they're actually plateauing. So if they had kept doing this for, say, another 10 generations, would it have plateaued out, or would it have gone down to 0, or what would this have gone up to? I also wonder why protein levels would be decreased if expression levels were unchanged, right? That's something that the biologist in me, I could come up with some hypotheses, but I don't totally know why. I don't know if it's necessarily relevant to the story that they're trying to tell, but it's interesting to me that for these down here, the transcript levels weren't any different than what they were in the parental strain, yet the amount of protein being produced was decreased. It's also interesting to me that there's a fair amount of variation between these late stage lines, with some of them actually, qualitatively appearing to be larger than what we saw in the parental line. And so I would again wonder if biologically there's something going on there. Having talked about the description, the analysis, the interpretation, now let's move to judgment and thinking about how well the authors executed the creation of these figures to suit their story, to help tell their story. So let's start with panel B and C, these scatter plots with the line through them. In general, I like these figures. I would have loved to have seen the two accompanying panels that we saw in the extended data figure. I get it, though, that there's only so much data you can put into a paper. There's over 50 panels in the main body of the paper. In the extended data figures, there's over 100, right? So there's just so many panels in here that you've got to pick and choose what you're going to include or not. So I think these panels are effective at telling the story that they want to tell. One thing in terms of comparing the two panels that I would have liked to have seen would be to put the y-axis on C on the same scale as it is in B, right? So it goes from 0 to 20, here it's from 0 to 40. And so the slope here, aside from being positive, is about, the absolute value of the slope is probably about half of what it is in B. And so does that matter? I don't know, right? It seems that the decrease in GCLC expression is happening faster than the increase in FSP1. And I think by kind of scaling these axes the way they have, they make it look like a parallel change when it's not quite parallel. Something else I notice about their legend is that they don't have the black points. So when I first looked at this figure, I thought, well, what are those black points, right? I had to go through and read the caption to better understand what those black points are. So I don't know why they couldn't have added an extra line. Maybe having a 5 element legend would have just been too much. One thing I noticed about the legends beyond that is that they've duplicated the legend. I think they only needed one of these. I don't know why they had to have it here as well as here. They also don't have legends down here. And so they're expecting the readers to look at these legends and be like, okay, these are the colors that we're seeing throughout the rest of the figure. So I don't think they needed both of these legends. And so I think they could have found space to put in the black dot. One other problem with putting a legend in a plot like this is that it can be confusing to the audience to know if this point or points near the legend are part of the legend or if they're part of the data. And so a helpful tool for that would be to draw a box around the legend to make it clear that this legend is separate from the data. I think they've found a good place to put the legend so that that's not such an issue. I also probably would have added a bit of jitter to these points. I see over here for day 6 that there is some jitter, and maybe here day 5, right? Because over here, I don't really know how many points are here on day 6. I assume that there's 4 because I see 4 over here, but I don't know, those get kind of hard to see. And so adding some jitter to it and perhaps putting a black border on these points, kind of like my favorite plotting symbol in R21, allows you to do where you could set the border, the stroke as it's called, to be black and the fill to be a different color. And then the R squared here, both in B and C have 4 significant digits. I really think that's overkill, right? I think they could get by with 2 significant digits, right? Call this 0.60, call this 0.31, we're good. I do not think they have enough data here to state with precision out to 4 significant digits what their R squared value is. I think that's a bit ridiculous. I suspect there's an expectation for papers in Nature, Cell Science, to have this absurd level of precision. And I think we're going to see that when I talk about the p-values down here in the bar plots as well. Now let's turn and think about panels E, G, I, and K. And a lot of my critiques are going to be the same there as they were for F, H, J, and L, the pooled analysis. So I'm seeing a lot of these types of plots in the literature. We certainly saw it in other figures within the same paper. And what is that? That's where they have a bar, and on top of the bar, they point points, and on top of the points, they then put the error bar. And so there was a paper published in PLOS Biology a number of years ago saying that bar plots were bad because they don't show you the data, because you could have like a bimodal distribution, kind of like we see here for LN118IL in panel E, where you have a cluster of points down perhaps around like 0.6, 0.7, and then you have a cluster of points around 1. And if you'd have only included the bar, you wouldn't see this bimodal distribution. And so the solution appears to be, well, let's do bars and points because both will be better. And I think it just kind of clouds up the plots. I have seen things where people put white points, where they might have like a green bar and then white points on top of that. And so you can see the white points on top of the bar, but you can't really see the white points when they're above the bar, right? So I think it's just kind of silly that there's, again, too much going on. And especially when you're looking at it at the scale of this, it's really impossible. It's really hard to see how many points there are. Again, the font here is quite small. I'm zoomed in quite a bit, and these points are smaller than the font, right? I'm having a hard time reading that -15 on a printed page, or in the figure that is on the website. These points are about the same size as that. And so being able to differentiate between those points is just really hard. And then doing that with this background is, again, further complicating things. So I would lose the bars. I think their intuition was correct in some of those other plots where they did something like a box and whisker plot or a jitter plot without the bar. I'm not a fan of violin plots for what it's worth. I think they're just kind of ugly. I don't know, it's just a matter of personal preference. But for a box plot and for a violin plot, you need a fair amount of data to have meaningful box and whiskers or violins. I have seen box and whisker plots on 3 points. It's ridiculous, right? Like, you know, the middle one is the median, right? And so I guess that brings us to another point, which is that the top of the bar is the mean. But for some of these, they don't have that much data, right? If we kind of come down here to this LN71134BL, there are 4 points here. The mean they drew here, but can you say that these are normally distributed? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think many of these are necessarily normally distributed. I don't think the mean makes sense unless you've got normally distributed data. I think when you've got a small number of points like this, use the median, or don't report the median, show the points. Also then, having plus or minus a standard deviation when you have 5 or 6 points or fewer, I don't think really does anything. I don't know what this bar does, right? Again, if we removed the error bar, if we removed the column bar and saw the points, we could get a sense of the central tendency in the data. And certainly you're giving us a p-value that goes to ridiculous level of precision. I don't think you need all this extra information. And so while I'm criticizing these p-values for being ridiculously small, I think people should pick a threshold and stick to that, right? This is below 0.05, it's below 10 to the minus 3. Put a star. Please don't put 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. I'm creating a new rule that if you have more stars than points, you're doing it wrong, okay? So a star is enough to say that it's significantly different from all the other points. And what would that do? Well, in this case, we have this long string showing the p-values, really in all of these panels. And so what they're then doing is they're adding a lot of extra space to the top of the plot, pushing down the data. So they're making it actually harder to see the data in the attempt to be, quote unquote, more reproducible by showing the p-values. We certainly see that here, right, where they go up to 8. Well, what if you removed all that and maybe you colored the text, the labels down here, by whether it was significant or not? Make it red if it's significant, black if it's not significant, and then give everything, again, a common y-axis scale, right? That you could go up to, I think, 5, right? So put everything going up to 5, and yeah, that would push this down a bit, but what would it do? It would, again, contextualize the GCLC levels relative to the FSP1 levels and everything else, right? Or if you didn't want to have a common y-axis, it would allow you to stretch out the points to get better resolution and see the variation in those points versus, again, compressing them down. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. But I think having these p-values in here really does a disservice to interpreting the data. Yes, it's telling you the significance level, the p-value, but pick a threshold, run with that. I'm pretty sure that that is coming from this reporting summary that all authors have to do. And so in here it says, for null hypothesis testing, the test statistic, FTR, with confidence intervals, effect size, degrees of freedom, and p-value noted. And it says, give p-values as exact values whenever suitable, right? So I think what people are thinking then is, give an exact p-value. Well, I'm going to give as many significant digits as possible. I'm going to make it as small as possible. I would also point out that this wants a lot of information that's not actually being included in the plots, right? Like, what's the degrees of freedom, right? They don't have that. The ends, the F statistics, those aren't included here. If we come back to the methods section, they have a paragraph on statistical analysis where they indicate all of the ends, right? So why not put the p-values in here too? No one's going to read this section and look at those ends. Give me a break. They're going to look at the points. They're going to look at the variation in the points and say, yeah, these values are a lot smaller than those values. Clearly, they're significant. So anyway, that would be my gripe with including these p-values. Put a star, pick a single geom, pick a single summary if you're going to use any summary at all. And I think when you have a small number of points and the points aren't obviously normally distributed, then you probably want to show the median and the interquartile range, the 25th to 75th percentile. Something else I'll comment on with these error bars is that they're really hard to see, right? And so over here, for this B16F0 in the GCLC, it's a gray bar on top of black points. And the error bars are so thin that you really can't see them. And again, when I look at the printed page, I can't see them at all. It's not there, right? So make them bigger, make them more pronounced, make them a different color. I don't know. And so kind of thinking about the color and these error bars, I'm also drawn to this LN118IL, and that the points are black rather than another shade of purple. Perhaps, use the early color that they had up in panels B and C, kind of like they did for these later stage ones, right? But again, I would lose the bar and I would focus on the points. So I'll calm down and stop my rant. One other thing I don't like about these x-axis labels is that they think they're very jargony, right? It's not immediately clear when you first look at these what days they came from. Like, okay, now, yep, I see the prefix LN7, LN8, LN9, but the rest of this title, I'm not sure what this is. What is 112AR? I don't know, right? Does it matter? Could you have called these like A, B, and C, A, B, and C, A, B? I think that would have been a lot simpler, right? And then maybe instead of having such a long title that's at an angle, you could either pivot the plot 90 degrees so it reads horizontally, or what you could do is again be like 1, 2, 3 or ABC or whatever, and then below that you could then put LN7, LN8, LN9 to make it clear that these are 3 replicates of this time point, this number of generations. So although we see these angled names a lot in the scientific literature, they are not ideal. They force one to kind of turn their head to read them, and that's just not as easy to read. There's a lot of stuff that's going vertically, right? Like the y-axis title, these p-values. Again, I don't want the p-values, but if they'd have shifted the whole thing 90 degrees, you could read everything left to right without causing any neck pain, all right? The other thing that I'll comment on with F, H, J, and L is that even if you don't want to give all 8 of these panels the same y-axis range, I think E and F, and then G and H, I and J, K and L, those pairs, they need to have the same y-axis range because, again, it's the same data. And so when we look at this and don't look at the axes, and again, the first thing you're going to look at are these bars, not the axes, you're going to say, oh, wow, there's a lot more here than there is over here. And that's not true. It's the same, right? The other thing that I would question, and I'm not a statistician, but I would question is whether you can actually do this, right? So I don't think that these 8 sets of green points are independent enough of each other. I would include them perhaps as covariates, right? So if you want to compare late to parental, I would probably work into an ANOVA, not a t-test, but work into an ANOVA that there are 8 different experimental blocks here. And so, again, I'll leave that for somebody else to worry about. But again, the plot is very much the same problem with having the bar and the points. The error bar is going to be very hard to see for pretty much anybody unless you're like really zooming in quite far. All right, that's enough. In general, I thought these plots were relatively easy to read, but I think there are ways to clean them up. And I really worry about this over precision of our p-values and our test statistics like an r-squared value, we don't need things out to 10 to the minus 15, right? If it's less than 1 in 1,000, that's good enough to say less than 1 in 1,000. If it's below 0.05 and that's your test threshold, put a star on it. Say it's significant. That's all we need, right? We don't need 2, 3, 5 stars. We don't need things out to 10 to the minus 15, 10 to the minus 12. That's just kind of ridiculous. And as we can see in this example, it actually makes it harder to see the data because it's then compressing the data to make room to include that text. All right, well, if you find another figure out there that interests you in the scientific literature, by all means, send it to me. I would love to incorporate that into my rotation of journals and figures and papers that I'm talking about here in these critiques. Please make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Give this a thumbs up. That would make me just feel all warm and gooey inside. And please tell your friends what we're doing here in Code Club so that everybody can benefit and learn to make better, more effective data visualizations with their science.